clean. They don't want it to be recorded, and so when the presentation stops, we'll pause and we'll go to questions. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Nitzan Peri-Rotem. She has got a fantastic program of research all about fertility, longitudinal analysis. She's a social demographer. And lots of really interesting papers on her web profile, including work on religiosity and how that influences fertility rates and things like that. So have a look at her web profile. I think it's fascinating. And I'm going to hand over to Nitzan. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark. And I would like also to thank the Institute of Data Science and AI for inviting me to talk about causality, which I think is both, it's fascinating both philosophically, but also empirically. And I will focus today on the issue of causality in observational studies. And I will mainly draw, from my own research on looking at religion and fertility. So, it just sometimes gets stuck. Yeah, okay. So I'm also teaching about causality in the university, and I like to use the image of this holy grail that causality, or managing to assess causality, is highly desirable, but it's very difficult, and some say that it's just impossible to achieve when using observational data. And the reason is that we basically have no control over who is exposed to the intervention and when they're exposed to the cause. And so it's basically very difficult to gauge the specific effect or to isolate the effect of the cause. To isolate the cause from other confounders, and to say that the cause actually is causing the effect. So so this is, I guess, all those interested in causality pretty much know about the basic statistical conditions. And I emphasize it is statistical conditions rather than theoretical conditions for assessing a causal link between X and Y. So, so statistically, we would need to establish that, first of all, that there is a correlation, that Y is dependent on X, so that the correlation is non-zero between X and Y. And there's also the condition, some say that's the truly causal criterion of that the temporal precedence that X happened before Y. And finally, and maybe that's one of the more difficult things to do in observational studies, to eliminate alternative explanations. And I want to look at each one of these conditions and talk about some challenges and pitfalls that are actually quite common in the process of assessing causal mechanisms. And I will use the example of religion and fertility, which it is one of the topics I have been working on for several years now. And there's a question: does religiosity cause higher fertility? Is being more religious causes you in some way to have more children? Is it a causal relationship? And I would start with the issue of correlation. And I want to, these are two quotes from a book that was recently published by Philip Jenkins. He's an American historian, and he published a book called Fertility and Faith: The Demographic Revolution and the Transformation of World Religions. And it is quite an interesting book, and very also quite looking globally at changes in religion. And there was, I think one of the more contentious section in this book was that he said the two factors, family size and religiosity, work intimately together in ways that are difficult to disentangle. If the correlation between fertility and faith is strong and easily demonstrated, the precise nature of causation is not so clear, nor need it be. And later in the book, he's also saying fertile societies tend to be more religious. Religious societies are more fertile. And I think, maybe if you, if you're interested in issues of causality, I think maybe this quote make you sit a bit uncomfortably in your chair. And it has drawn some criticism by some reviewers. But I actually wanted to focus on some of the assumptions that are made here about the correlation, not even talking about causality. So we all know well, we can chant from our sleep that correlation does not imply causation. However, causation must imply some correlation between X and Y. And there are some interesting questions that we might explore about the nature of this correlation. And so one question, is the correlation between fertility and faith indeed strong or consistent and easily demonstrated? And second question, is it societies or individuals that tend to have higher fertility when religiosity levels are higher? So I took data. I looked at data from the European Social Survey. This is the most recently available. It's pre-pandemic data, so it's from 2018. And so I just, this is my own analysis. So it's based on data from 29 countries in Europe. And basically, I correlated for each country the proportion of those who are religiously affiliated and the completed fertility. So this is the total number of children that people had after they finished their reproductive years, so between ages 40 and 80. And you can see, some of the countries. So Cyprus has a very high proportion of religiously affiliated. You can also find Poland there, Lithuania, Italy, there's Serbia as well, Slovakia, there's, you see, Ireland have both high religiosity and high fertility. Iceland looks like a bit of an outlier with relatively high fertility as well. Czechia, and also you can find there Estonia, Netherlands, Sweden on the side of the least religious countries in Europe. And you can see quite clearly that, it's basically the correlation or the slope approximates zero. And if anything, it's even negative if there is any correlation. And this is quite perplexing because, it's not what we would expected. We would expect it to see countries that are more religious to have higher fertility. So what is actually going on? So this is the relationship between countries. What if we look within countries individually and look at the fertility of those who are religiously affiliated, you can see it in orange, and those who are not religiously affiliated. And you can see quite consistently within each country, the religious have higher fertility. Not universally, not in all of them, or it's not significant in all of them, but we can see pretty much very consistently within each country, the more religious have higher fertility. So Yeah, seems like a bit of a paradox. If we find this correlation within countries, why don't we see the same correlation between countries? And yes, just this is just to clear one of the examples. So yeah, you can see here, just as an example, Sweden have 41% religiously affiliated with a completed fertility rate of 2 children. Italy has 82% religiously affiliated, but with a fertility rate of 1.5. So basically, you can see how the between countries correlation looks like, because in Sweden, whether you're religious or not, you have higher fertility than people in Italy, whether they're religious or not. So basically, there are other things that are working at the individual levels and other things working at the country level. And it's a surprisingly common pitfall, what is called the level of analysis or cross-level pitfall, when we erroneously assuming that the relationship that is found in one level of analysis also applies to another level of analysis. And in this particular case, we assume that the relationship at the lower individual level also applies at the societal, national level of analysis. And it's also known as the reverse ecological fallacy. And this is a quote from Hofstede. He's saying, cultures are not king-size individuals. They are wholes, and their internal logic cannot be understood in terms used for the personality dynamics of individuals. And we know obviously other powers are affecting fertility. So it could be the certain socio-economic conditions in a given countries, housing conditions, labor market conditions, gender norms in each countries. And all of these factors also influence fertility. And so that's why we see this imbalance, or that actually the relationship at the individual level does not appear at the between country level. So how do we overcome the cross-level fallacy? Well, the first step would be to acknowledge that it might happen, that it exists. And one strategy is to analyze the within group correlations, which you have seen in the figure before. So examine relationship between religion and fertility for each country separately. It's also possible to pull the data together, estimate the relationship across all individuals, regardless of the group affiliation. So you can see this figure here. If it's the exact same data. If we are comparing fertility of affiliated and non-affiliated together, then we see that the more religious have significantly higher fertility. But that's again at the individual level. And so even when we talk about something that seems quite simple, like assessing correlation, there are still issues that we might, that we need to take into consideration. So I'm moving on to talk about the issue of temporal precedence. How do we control for order of events? And so it's not enough to just establish that X, that they are correlated, but we also need to establish that X preceded Y. And if we think about religion and fertility, there might be some mechanisms that work in both directions. So more religious people may hold stronger pronatalist values, leading to increased fertility. But also having children or having a large family may lead to higher involvement in religious communities, especially if those communities provide some services services for children or for families. And so if we want to control for that, that would require analysis of longitudinal data and at the individual level. So we've established that we're looking at the individual level. And so this is an example of a study that did exactly that by Caroline Berghammer. She has like very nice, simple, elegant studies. And she used panel data from the Netherlands, looking across 6 waves. So looking at church attendance and childbearing. And basically, it involved 2 different types of analysis. So how religiosity in wave 1 predicted number of children a few waves later. And she found quite robust positive correlation that the more religious had about those who attended weekly had about on average half a child more. It's fun to talk about, but on average they had significantly higher fertility. And then she also looked at whether those who have had a child had any change in their level of religiosity in the next waves. And basically, there was no any evidence for that. So in this case, she's showing religiosity did predict higher fertility in later years, but fertility did not predict any change. Well, neither decrease nor increase in levels of religiosity in the following years. So, but this is evidence from one country. There's, if we look at the UK list. This is a study by James Tilley. I mean, you might know, if you're interested in politics and religion, you might know his work. And he's also done quite a similar study. And well, interestingly, he found that having children was linked with increased church attendance for women, but not for men. And also he found that this increase was relatively modest. And so childbearing was pretty much a weak predictor of changes in religious behavior. And well, basically what both of these studies showed is that people are not very likely to change their religiosity over the life course anyway. It was quite stable. So there's much stronger evidence that religiosity is likely to affect fertility, but much weaker evidence the other way around. Although, well, it's still, so we see that there is some effect in some conditions, or in some conditions that do show some effect of fertility on religiosity. So it also raises some questions of how do we deal with weak effects, or when the correlation exists, but it's not that strong. And there's the Granger's approach of causation is basically, this is an idea of causation as robust dependency, or causation as a predictive power. And according to him, X causes Y if, after taking all of available information, so counting for all confounding variables, if after acknowledging all that, X contributes to our ability to predict Y, then basically this is enough to treat it as causing Y. So if it adds anything to our ability to predict future values of Y while controlling for other confounders, then this is considered statistically causal. And he also talked about, I mean, if we think about the case of religion and fertility, so according to this approach, basically we cannot really rule out the occurrence of feedback. So basically we see evidence of both ways, that religiosity can affect fertility, but also fertility might affect religiosity. So we cannot completely rule it out, at least well, based on this approach. So yeah, this approach also was criticized, first of all, by not paying sufficient attention to theory, because it's purely statistical causation, not taking into account any theoretical assumptions. And according to Holland, he also criticized Granger's causation by saying this is only temporary or provisional causation. So if we had a change of Z, so if we gather more information, what has been a causal relationship is actually would be a spurious relationship. And I also wanted to bring this interesting quote by Holland, saying the cause of a given effect is always subject to revision as our knowledge about the phenomenon increases. For example, do bacteria cause disease? Well, yes, until we dig deeper and find that it is the toxins in the bacteria that produce, that really cause the disease. And this is really not that either. Certain chemical reactions are the real causes, and so on ad infinitum. I would say I agree with the claim that causation could be seen as provisional, but I don't exactly agree with the logic, and I will explain why. In this example by Holland, the confounders that he talks about, the toxins or the chemical reactions, these are not exactly confounding variables, but these are intervening variables. So that leads me to the final potential pitfalls in controlling for confounding variables. There's recently came out, well, I highly recommend to read the paper by Bartram from 2020, where he talked about the differences between confounding and intervening variables and how it might influence the way we assess causality. And so the purpose of adding control variables is to minimize bias in our estimates. So if we take the example, I mean, if we think about correlation between shoe size and math ability. So like we would see that there is a correlation, but once we control, for example, for age, this correlation would appear as spurious because age affects both shoe size and also math abilities. So then it would give us, it would minimize our bias to control for that. But he said some control variables are not determinants of X. We cannot treat them as determining X. Instead, they are determined by X, meaning that they intervene the relationship between X and Y. And so therefore, adding these variables would therefore increase bias rather than reducing it. So in what is actually saying, it's not sufficient to establish that X preceded Y, but also the confounding variables should be causally prior to X. And this, so this basically accounting for confounding would not be the same as accounting for intervening variables. And so just to follow on that, there's also the difference between direct, indirect, and total effects. So if we want, like we said, we want the net effect, if we want to gauge the effect of X on Y, we first need to estimate the total effect. So how would we do that? We would run a regression analysis that would include confounding factors but exclude intervening factors. And so, so in this case, we would estimate the total effect of X on Y. And then after identifying the total effect, we can further explore the mechanism through which X affects Y by adding controls for intervening variables. So this would give us the indirect effect of X on Y. And if there's still any remaining relationship, any remaining association between X and Y, that would be the direct effect of X on Y. But so the idea is that it's not the net effect by controlling for all confounders, but it's the net effect controlling for the indirect effect of X itself. Although there is one caveat in this approach, is that sometimes we don't have a clear distinction between a confounder and an intervening variables. Some variables may actually be both affecting Y and affected by affected by X. So we would have to basically go back to check our theory, or check what is more statistically robust. So going back to the example of intermediate fertility, of religion and fertility, there in the 1950s, Kingsley Davis and Judith Blake, they developed an analytical framework for analyzing how factors at the societal or cultural or environmental level, how would they affect fertility? And the idea is that the effect would go through the intermediate fertility variables. So, and it is also known as the proximate determinants of fertility. And that includes both biological and behavioral factors through which these societal level variables are affecting fertility. And it was originally, a list of several items that these intermediate fertility variables were on, but it has been later revised, mainly by Baumgartz, who's a Dutch demographer, American Dutch demographer. But overall, these main proximate determinants of fertility, so they would include sexual exposure, use of contraception, also induced abortion, and there's postpartum infectability, and that basically depends on length of breastfeeding, because breastfeeding is a natural contraceptive. And those who, if a woman breastfeeds more and longer, that would affect the ability to conceive. And and there are actually, obviously there are differences by socioeconomic level or by cultural differences in the length of breastfeeding. And so the idea of the proximate determinants of fertility, unlike the socioeconomic factors, if one of them changes, fertility necessarily changes as well, assuming that the other proximate determinants are constant. So based on this framework, we can actually specify some mechanisms to put on the test to have a better understanding or exploration of how religiosity might influence fertility. Although it's quite interesting, even though this list was revised, they actually didn't take into account assisted reproductive technologies, which is also influenced by level of the usage would be influenced by level of religiosity or other factors. But yeah, just looking at the, so if we, starting at, maybe at the bottom, postpartum infectability. So we know studies have shown that more religious women tend to breastfeed more. So actually this would be more likely a positive effect, which leads to reduced fertility. In terms of contraception and induced abortion, so, well, both in this case, I would say the popular knowledge is pretty much aligned with empirical studies showing that more religious people have lower usage of contraception, modern contraceptive, also less likely to perform induced abortion, and since contraception and abortion are negatively linked with fertility, so that would mean a positive effect of religiosity on fertility. With sexual exposure, it's a bit, there's mixed findings, so it's not very clear, because in religious people will, on average, would be less likely to be sexually active outside of marriage, but they have higher marriage rates. And there's still not really conclusive evidence about whether there's a higher sexual exposure. So it's still a bit indeterminate. So we can't, we don't have very clear conclusions, but we can at least put it to the test, put these specific mechanisms. And obviously when we look at these models, so obviously we would also need to control for other confounding variables like level of education or other potential environmental socioeconomic factors that might confound the effect of religiosity on fertility. So, so I will just summarize. So there are some quite common pitfalls in the process of exploring causal mechanisms. So I would say it goes way beyond the idea of mixing correlation with causation. And so when we explore these mechanisms, so we should take into account whether we're making inferences first at the right level of analysis. Is it individuals, culture, societies? And there's the issue of whether the data allows us to control for order of events. And this is also quite problematic in many cases because longitudinal data is quite, it's quite expensive to produce. And in many cases, we would have to rely on cross-sectional studies, and that will not really enable us to control for order of events. And at least in most cases, unless we look at maybe childhood circumstances, but that would also make it a bit difficult if we only have retrospective data and not prospective data. And the final question, does the model include only confounding or also intervening variables? And this is also not always a very clear-cut thing. And so acknowledging these issues will not necessarily enable us to assess causation, but it will help us to minimize bias, at least. And I will just finish with the quote by George Box, who's a British statistician. And he said, essentially, all models are wrong, but some models are useful. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nitzan. If you stop sharing there.
Yeah. think there's
So there was a question in the chat. I'm just wondering, nobody on the line can see us, can you? I was hoping that when we stop sharing that they would be able to see. Maybe not. Oh, if you click on start video, maybe.
Did I just have voice
I
and not?
think possibly.
Oh, no.
Yeah, I should have fixed that.
No.
Sorry about that. I thought it was an issue. So you can see us now, everybody online. Apologies, everyone. Thank you very much, Nitzan. That was really fascinating. A lot of references there of stuff that I'd never heard of. I think there's a whole literature of causality that I haven't come across. The Granger causality, I think, is the one that has permeated basic statistical inference the most, and I think that's the way that I've thought about it until I found out about other approaches. So there was a question there in the chat. You can see there, Mary asked a question.
Should I go from the?
I think there's only been one if you just go.
Or just.
Oh yeah, there you
is
go.
it? Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Wait,
Oh, that's a good idea. We should stop recording.